knowledge is when we explain the unknown in terms of the known, when we succeed in fitting a new experience into our system of concepts and ideas. And I would call understanding the direct and unmediated contact with reality as it is experienced moment by moment. Knowledge is a knowledge essentially of the old. It is the old, in this sense, is this set of notions and ideas which we fabricate out of our direct experience. It is like a series of finished articles manufactured from our perceptions and our emotions, our feelings of all kinds, and embodied in the traditional form of language and of accepted ideas. Understanding, on the other hand, is essentially a contact with the new as it perpetually presents itself. Knowledge is knowledge of the finished article, and understanding is understanding of the raw material. There, we see, of course, from this definition, that knowledge can always be communicated, but understanding cannot be communicated. Understanding is direct experience, and as we know, in every field, no direct experience is communicable. No one can have a direct feeling of somebody else's pain or somebody else's love or hunger. And in the same way, nobody can have anybody else's direct experience, direct contact with an event or a situation. There can, of course, be knowledge about understanding, and such knowledge is naturally useful inasmuch as it proves to us that certain understandings have taken place in the past and that understanding is at all times possible. But this knowledge of understanding, like any other form of knowledge, is not understanding itself. The finished article is not the raw material. And as I say, we cannot pass on understanding, though we can pass on knowledge by means of words or other symbols. Now, every adult possesses large stocks of knowledge. Some of this knowledge is correct, some of it is incorrect, some of it merely looks like knowledge and is neither correct nor incorrect, but actually meaningless. It is pseudo-knowledge. Such pseudo-knowledge is knowledge which cannot be verified. This has been discussed by modern technical philosophy, by the logical positivists, who've made it very clear that meaning can be attributed to any proposition only insofar as it can be verified in actual experience. The fact that you can have images about a concept is no proof that it is a valid or true concept. For example, while we have no images of the nature of the electromagnetic field or the gravitational field, nevertheless, statements made about these fields have a complete meaning because one can deduce from these statements other statements which are perceptually verifiable. And metaphysical statements are statements which, according to the logical positivists, are without meaning. They are expressive in the same way as lyrical poetry is expressive, but they are not meaningful. And one of the great difficulties which has afflicted mankind from the beginning is first of all his tendency to assume that pseudo-knowledge is real knowledge, and secondly, his tendency to imagine that knowledge is the same as understanding. These two things are very closely related. And they are both very serious, one may call them sins of the intellect. They result in most grave aberrations. For example, most of the appalling atrocities committed in the name of religion, of organized religion, and we must remember that organized religion has committed endless atrocities. These atrocities are essentially due to the confusion between knowledge and understanding and between knowledge and pseudo-knowledge. There has been an immense overvaluation of words in religion because words have been taken for things. They have been taken, the finished product has been taken as the equivalent of the raw material, the direct experience. The statements about God have been mistaken as the actual experience of God. Consequently, we see in many religions the setting up of dogmas, which is essentially an idolatrous worship of words, the insistence upon uniformity of belief, the insistence upon assent by all and sundry to certain concepts, and persecution when there is political power in the hands of the dogmatizers if people refuse to indulge in this form of word worship. And this is a very, very grave matter, this business of confusing knowledge with understanding. It is not a two-way matter. Those who have understanding, the rare men and women, I think, who have understanding in all situations, are always sufficiently intelligent not to mistake their understanding for knowledge. They see quite well that a system of conceptual knowledge is just as necessary to the conduct of life as a spontaneous insight into reality as it arises moment by moment. But the contrariwise mistake, the mistake of imagining that knowledge is understanding, is terribly common and is, as I say, responsible for many of our miseries. And it's interesting here, I think, to speculate on the proportion of human misery which is due to our own fault and the proportion which is due to the nature of the world. I would say roughly that perhaps 1/3 of our miseries are of cosmic origin. They are miseries due to the fact that we are embodied and that we inherit genes which are afflicted by deleterious mutations. Also, and in a sense too, our miseries, this part of our miseries, may be called the rent extorted by nature for the privilege of living on the surface of this planet where the soil is largely poor and the climate is bad, and the inhabitants of the planet include immense numbers of microorganisms causing diseases in man himself and his domestic animals and his cultivated plants. Well, this, as I say, accounts perhaps for 1/3 of the total misfortunes of the human race. The remaining 2/3, I think, we bring upon ourselves. They are homemade disasters, and a great many of these homemade disasters are due to what may be called sins of the intellect. We've spoken of the sin of the intellect, which consists in thinking that knowledge is understanding, and the other sin of the intellect, which consists in thinking that pseudo-knowledge is knowledge. And closely related to these two sins are the almost universal sins of oversimplification, over-abstraction, over-generalization. Worthwhile perhaps to give an example or two of these things. Let's take the overgeneralization. This consists of saying without any evidence that the general form of the statement is all x's are y, or all a's have a single cause which is b. I mean, you get in the Middle Ages, for example, the communist overgeneralization was all infidels are damned. Well, from the Muslim point of view, all infidels meant all Christians, and from the Christian point of view, all infidels meant all Muslims. Then there was another very common overgeneralization, that all heretics are inspired by the devil and all eccentric old women are witches. And then in the terrible period of the wars of religion in the 16th and 17th century, these persecutions and battles were motivated by very, very simple overgeneralizations, which were all Catholics are the enemies of God, or if you happen to be on the Pope's side, all Lutherans, Calvinists, and Anglicans are the enemies of God. And in our own time, we've seen exactly the same appalling intellectual sins committed by the dictators. I mean, the Nazis made this same sort of overgeneralization. They said that all the ills of humanity have one cause, which is Jews, and all Jews are subhuman enemies of mankind. And similarly, among the communists, we have the same overgeneralization. All the ills of humanity are due to one cause, which is capitalists, and all capitalists and their supporters are subhuman enemies of mankind. Well, on the face of it, obviously such overgeneralizations cannot possibly be true. But the fact remains that the temptation to this kind of intellectual delinquency is fearfully strong, and that most of us find it extremely difficult to resist it when the temptation is presented. We can resist such things as the Hitlerian overgeneralizations, but notice in conversation how easy it is for one to fall into the sort of all x's are y type of statement, how universal this is. Every demagogue and every crusader has always made use of these products of intellectual delinquency. And this, as I say, is a very important point when we consider the problem of knowledge in its relation to understanding. Well, now let us go rather further into this whole question of knowledge, leaving our understanding to a discussion for a later part of this lecture. Knowledge, there are very many circumstances in human life in which understanding is not essential. Understanding, as I say, is essential in coping with the personal relationships towards ourselves, towards other people, towards events as they arise moment by moment in life. But there are many circumstances in human life where conceptual knowledge, organized and accumulated and handed on from generation to generation, is the only useful thing which we can have. For example, suppose I wish to manufacture sulfuric acid or to keep accounts for a banker. I go to a school where these subjects are taught, or I buy a book in which the accumulated experience in relation to these subjects has been set forth. I do not have to have, in these particular circumstances, a moment-to-moment understanding of what arises. All that is necessary for me as a professional man is that I should acquire the maximum amount of correct knowledge in these fields. And as I have said before, knowledge is communicable, can be handed down, can be enshrined in words and other forms of symbols, and bequeathed from one generation to another, and is a growing stock of a treasure of information. And quite clearly, any form of education must contain as an essential element the handing on of the maximum amount of correct information. And this is especially true, of course, in an industrial civilization like our own, where the success of any given society depends entirely on its ability to continue technological development and to understand what is going on in this highly complicated world we live in. Now, I think it's worth developing this for a little bit. As you've probably seen in your newspapers and magazines, there is now a growing concern in this country precisely because of this problem of knowledge. There is a crisis of knowledge going on that during a period when every other nation has made enormous efforts to impart more knowledge, more correct knowledge to more young people, the many professional educators in this country, educationists, have followed the opposite course, and they have followed it through a mistaken interpretation, I would say, of Dewey's conception of learning through doing and of education as life adjustment and self-realization. They have applied these principles of Dewey in such a way that in many schools there is now a great deal of doing without any learning. And also they have taught adjustment to practically everything except the central 20th century fact that unless we have a great deal of correct knowledge, the society in which we live is bound to decline and finally go to destruction, because we cannot persist in this type of industrial civilization without an immense amount of correct knowledge. And I must say the figures which are quoted are very alarming. I mean, the fact, for example, that 50 years ago, more than 50% of all high school students studied algebra, and now less than 25% study it. 50 years ago, something like 30% studied geometry, now only 11%. Nearly 20% studied physics, now only 4%. That more than half the schools in the country give no courses in either physics or chemistry. These are very alarming facts. And quite clearly, the situation is becoming sufficiently terrifying to force a change in this whole policy. It's quite clear that we're going to get a form of education which will put more stress than has been put during the last 20 or 30 years on the imparting of correct knowledge, which we cannot do without. But of course, education is more than the imparting of correct knowledge. This is an essential element in any rational education at the present time or at any time. But there is also this other element, the element which Dewey calls life adjustment and self-realization. This has always been regarded as one of the ends of education, the most important end after the imparting of correct knowledge. Well, the problem is, how shall we promote life adjustment and self-realization? There have been many answers to this question. Most of them belong to one or other of two main educational families, the classical and the progressive. The progressive is inclined to concentrate on the immediate problems of the present. It answers the questions by providing courses in such strange subjects as consumer economics and job information and even consumer mathematics, whatever that may be, and with more sensible things like courses in family relationships and mental health and all the rest of it. But it does tend, as the facts seem to show, to neglect what used to be called the fundamentals and what still remain fundamentals in any highly organized technical society. The classical answer to the problem is made in terms of courses in Greek and Latin literature, in the foreign languages, modern languages and literature, in world history, and in philosophy to some extent, above all in Western philosophy, because Eastern philosophy is completely ignored at present. And we may ask why, what is the point of classical education? I mean, after all, Virgil and Homer seem a very long way away, even Chaucer and Shakespeare seem a very long way away. So why bother with classical education? Well, the answer has been given many times and can be summed up, I think, quite easily. That the whole concept of the value of a classical education is to produce not so much a disciplined mind. People talk about this thing, the discipline of Latin grammar and so on, which I think is nonsense, but rather to produce an experienced mind. Emerson pointed out that this type of education produced a sense of immense longevity. It permits the person who has had it to view contemporary events in the light of this immense vicarious experience running back over more than 2,000 years, which is included in the classical education. Well, there's obviously a great deal to be said for this, but we have to remember the fact that the vicarious experience to be obtained from the humanities of 2,000 years ago is, to a considerable extent, irrelevant to the facts of the 20th century. In many ways, of course, our own society resembles very much the society of antiquity. But in other respects, our world is profoundly different from the antique world. Let us take a few obvious examples. In their world, the rate of change was exceedingly slow. In our world, thanks to advancing technology, the rate of change is extraordinarily fast and keeps society in what may be called a chronic state of revolution. Then again, to consider some of the moral problems. In their world, infanticide was taken for granted, and slavery was regarded not only as necessary to the Greek way of life, but also as rational and proper and right. We obviously cannot, being the heirs of 18th and 19th century humanitarianism, we cannot accept this point of view. We cannot hope to solve our economic and demographic problems in this, to us, hideous way in which they were solved in the past. Well, then take another point on which there are profound differences between ourselves and the people of antiquity. It's interesting inasmuch as this point was commented on by Cicero, who said that people who did not know what had gone on in the world before them were doomed to remain perpetual children. Well, curiously enough, the men of his time and his predecessors did not know what had gone on before them. Actually, it's only in the last 5 generations that anything like a complete history of mankind has come into existence. It's incredible. I mean, even 100 years ago, how little the historians, even the greatest historians of the period, knew how small the materials at their disposal were. Actually, it is only within the last 5 generations that this immense historical knowledge has opened up before us. We know now about man's past, going back for 500,000 years at least, and we know about the activities of human societies in every continent. And this was absolutely impossible to the people of antiquity. You get, for example, the greatest historian of antiquity, Thucydides, saying in the preface to his history of the Peloponnesian War that nothing of any great importance had happened before his own time, which seems a rather astounding statement in the light of what we know now. So that here again, the experience of the vicarious experience derived from the study of the old humanities is not entirely adequate to our present needs. So what we need, I think, in the matter of education is a kind of combination between the classical and the progressive point of view. What we need is a teaching of the humanities of the past, of the humanities of the present, and maybe of the humanities of the foreseeable future. We have to combine a knowledge of the local cultural tradition with a teaching, partly vocational and partly psychological, of adaptation to present social needs and to the probable needs of the immediate future. For this purpose, we shall need a modified form of the classical curriculum, and I think a modified form of the progressive curriculum, because we need something a bit more realistic than consumer economics and job information. In this vertiginously changing world of ours, this is not enough. And then, to a combination of the classical and the progressive, then we shall have to add, of course, the inculcation of correct information, in other words, scientific and technical training. Well, this education, this ideal education, which is far from existing at present, but which is not at all beyond the bounds of possibility, we have to ask of this, we have to ask in relation to this, will this promote the self-realization of which John Dewey spoke? In our vocabulary, will it help us towards understanding? Now, however excellent such an education may be, I don't think it will help us towards understanding, because what such an education will do is to adapt us essentially to the old. It will adapt us to the traditions embodied in words and ideas which have come down to us in the past. It will give us experience. It will make our minds experienced. But the paradox of our existence is precisely this, that we need experience in order to do the practical affairs of life. But in regard to what may be called understanding, in regard to immediate insights, immediate contact with reality moment by moment, experience is very often a handicap. We have to circumvent it, to get rid of it. There's a saying in the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu where he says, knowledge is adding to your stock day by day. The practice of the Tao is subtracting. This doesn't mean, of course, that we can live by subtraction alone. We have to go on adding, Otherwise, we should not be able to exist in this highly complicated world. But it does mean that there are many circumstances in life where addition is not only not enough, but is actually an obstacle, and where we somehow have to subtract, to strip ourselves, in order to get this immediate understanding through direct contact with reality moment by moment. This, of course, is as I come back to this question of the paradox, our whole existence is a paradox. This is the fundamental paradox, that these conditionings, this learning of language, this accumulation of experience, is precisely the thing that makes us human. There is a kind of metaphysical slogan used by the existentialist philosophers now, which says, existence is prior to essence. Well, this happens to be one of the few metaphysical statements which can be verified. It is verified by the knowledge we have of the so-called wolf children, the children who have been adopted by animals and have been brought up in animal surroundings and have survived and have then been brought back into human societies, where these children have the form of human beings but are not human. So it becomes quite clear that the essence of humanity is not inherited. We are not born with it. We come into it. We make ourselves human. We grow into humanity. And we grow into humanity partly by imitating our elders, partly by acquiring speech with the enormous potentialities of conceptual knowledge which speech gives us, partly by building up fixed behavior patterns and patterns of words and ideas. These are the things which make us human. We would not be human if it were not for this education. But paradoxically, these are the things precisely which make understanding difficult or impossible. We have to be... The paradox is this, that this type of conditioning is required in order to produce a form of developed consciousness. But in order to use this developed consciousness in its highest capacity, which is in the capacity of understanding, we have to subtract everything that was added. All our life is a paradox, of course. This is just merely one of the numerous things that we find so puzzling in our lives. We can put it in another way. We can say that language, which is, of course, the medium in terms of which education is carried on, language is necessary and essential, but in many circumstances of life it is absolutely fatal. And we find this again in the questions of direct experience of reality. If we're tied up, if we allow ourselves to be dominated by linguistic formulae and recollections of word patterns, we shall not have a fresh and novel response to a fresh and novel situation. We shall respond to the new with the old. And the old is always, in some measure, irrelevant to the new. So, however good our education may be, our education in a knowledge of the tradition, the cultural tradition, and in adaptation to the immediate facts of the present and the foreseeable future, however good such an education is, it is always an education in terms of concepts, in terms of the organized old experience, and it is never in the nature of things an education in understanding, in an education in responding in a new way to new circumstances. Well, now we have to consider how do we get understanding? How can we make it possible for ourselves to have understanding? Well, the first thing to be realized is that we can't force ourselves to have understanding. We can't will understanding. We can't laboriously get it. We simply have to create the circumstances in which, so to speak, understanding will come to us of its own accord. The mind, again, this is another of the strange paradoxes we discover. Our minds are, to a great extent, external to our personal selves. We see this, of course, again and again. We are aware of, for example, take this business of just moving a hand. How do I move a hand? I don't move it. I give a command or I think of it, and somebody else does the moving. Or else, how do I, when I cut myself, how do I heal the wound? Again, I don't do it. We find, when we look at ourselves closely, that there is an immense area, in regard to our personal selves, an immense area of ignorance and impotence. We don't know, and we are unable to do innumerable things which, in our habitual bumptiousness, we think that we do know and we do. But the moment we look into this thing carefully, we find that we don't know and that we do not do these things ourselves. After all, the fundamental fact of our existence, the fact that there is a relation between mind and body, we know nothing about. We know that there is such a relation, but when it comes to the question, how does an electrochemical event in the brain transform itself into the perception of, say, a quartet by Haydn or a thought about Socrates, we haven't the faintest idea. This is just a fact which we have to accept, and we don't know. And it's the same with practical things, with what we can do or not do. There is you may remember a well-known little piece of rhetoric by Henley, which ends up, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. Well, actually nothing could be further from the truth. We are not masters of our fate. Nobody is the master of his fate. The most that we can do is to cooperate with our fate and thereby, to some extent, direct it. And we are not the captains of our soul. We are merely the noisiest passenger. We're a passenger so unimportant we don't even sit at the captain's table. We don't know, even by report, what the soul ship looks like, or how it works, or where it is going. We just accept these extraordinary facts. And here, I think, is the secret of the what may be called the method of coming to contemplation. The method is essentially a method of total awareness. This is, of course, it's a very ancient doctrine. The doctrine of know thyself is at least as old as civilization, perhaps much older, I don't know. And when you examine the doctrine of know thyself, it isn't merely a question of indulging in introspection. To know yourself, you have to know your environment too, to have direct awareness of it. Because after all, our own body is part of the environment. It's a natural object among other natural objects. And our mind consists, to a very large extent, of reactions to the environment, both animate and inanimate and personal. So that the command, know thyself, is in fact a command for total awareness. And the beginning of total awareness is an awareness of what I've been talking about, this ignorance and impotence in which we live, this fact that the catalogue of what we don't know and cannot achieve can be lengthened almost indefinitely. Even such a thing as thought probably doesn't really belong to me. If you remember, Descartes held it up as the primary certainty, the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." But if you look at this carefully, this is the most dubious proposition, because is it I who actually think? Here, language throws an interesting light. Language, after all, is a sort of collection of fossil observations and latent philosophy. And when we think particularly well, we find ourselves using phrases like, "a good idea occurred to me," or "it came into my head," or "I see it now." All these phrases, what do they imply? They imply that thoughts arise outside the sphere of the subjective ego and are found by it. And probably it would be, instead of saying, "I see, therefore I am," it would be probably much truer to say, "Thoughts come into existence, and I sometimes find them." So that, as I say, this list of our impotencies and ignorances can be lengthened almost indefinitely. Well, many people find this at first a humiliating and even depressing thought. But actually, I think it's a source of peace and a reason for cheerfulness and serenity. Because, after all, I can do very little and I can know very little. And yet, here I am. I may be discontented or unhappy, miserable, but I'm alive and kicking. I survive. I get by. I even get on sometimes. And if we take these two classes of facts, the fact of my ignorance and impotence and the fact of my survival, what can we infer from them? Well, we can infer something which is extremely consoling. We can infer that we are associated with a not I, which must be extraordinarily knowledgeable and intelligent and strong in order to prevent us from completely wrecking everything. Because in spite of all our efforts at egotistic sabotage, we do think on the whole fairly relevantly, and our physical functioning is on the whole not too abnormal. So that if we choose to cooperate with this greater power and greater knowledge with which we are associated, then everything is all right. Even if the worst happens, it's somehow all right. Whereas if we don't cooperate, even in the best of circumstances, we're all wrong. So, and this is, I think, the first important thing we gain from total awareness. Well, then there's another very important thing which happens when we start being totally aware, which is in connection with memory. There are obviously two forms of memory, one which is entirely beneficent and the other which is mainly harmful. The factual memory, the memory of how to make sulfuric acid or to the multiplication table, is wholly to the good. But emotionally charged memories are, as all psychiatrists know, a cause of neurosis and psychosis. Even at the best, they're a cause of endless distractions. Wordsworth has this phrase, you remember, and I would wish my day, the child is father of the man, and I would wish my days to be bound each to each in mute natural piety. But what is natural piety? Natural piety is essentially indulging in memories of vanished loves and past happiness. Well, we have no right to spend our time in this. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, and also the good thereof. We have no right to spend the present instant either in wallowing in the thoughts of past happiness, or in bemoaning past misfortunes, or having remorse over old offences. Similarly, we have no right to spend the present moment in anticipating hypothetical pleasures in the future, or apprehending possible disasters to come. And when we have this total awareness, we shall find a very interesting thing. If we are totally aware of our distractions, which are mostly emotionally charged memories or fantasies based upon emotionally charged memories, we shall find that while we have the awareness, this mental whirligig comes to a stop, and the memory is emptied. This phrase, the emptying of the memory, is an interesting one. It's used by St. John of the Cross, who makes the, at first, startling statement that the emptying of the memory is a good second only to union with God, and is, of course, a necessary condition to union with God. Well, we cannot empty the memory by an act of will, and we cannot empty it by concentration, even by concentration on the idea of emptiness. It can be emptied, I think, only by total awareness, by becoming aware of these endless temptations to get out of the present moment, which stop the whirligig. And not only does total awareness result in emptying the memory, at first only for a moment or two at a time, but I think perhaps later on more completely and more permanently, it also seems to have a certain effect on the what may be called the moral tone of the organism. If I become totally aware of my envy and resentment and uncharitableness, I shall find during the time of that awareness that these feelings are replaced by a new and more realistic response to the circumstances surrounding me. There is here again, something happens which could not happen as a result of an act of will or as a result of concentration. This openness of total awareness produces, as a byproduct, so to speak, the state which we desire, this complete openness to reality, making possible the coming of understanding. When we go forward into this deepening total awareness, we shall find another very important thing. This, I think, has been known by many mystics in the past. It's something which you get hints of certainly in the Buddhist mysticism and certainly in Christian mysticism too. And interestingly enough, it's a fact which seems to have been rediscovered now by certain modern psychiatrists. The fact that total awareness produces a change in general behavior and a change in the whole apprehension of the nature of the world. I was very struck the other day in reading this passage from Professor Carl Rogers, the psychiatrist, who was speaking about this as a new discovery. I mean, actually it's immensely old, but it's, thank heaven, it's being rediscovered, where he says that he says in this passage that if we can add to the ordinary visceral and perceptual awareness common to all animals the free and wide awareness of which only human beings are capable, then, he says, we have an organism of which we need not be afraid. He says we have to be very afraid of the human being's behavior when he excludes from his awareness any considerable area of his experience. Most of the time we exclude from awareness a large area of our experience. We allow ourselves to be conditioned by these verbal hypnotic suggestions, and we shut out large areas of our awareness. But, says Professor Rogers, when we open ourselves up to complete awareness, then we find ourselves as aware of what he calls the culture as of the personal needs for food or sex. We are just as aware of a desire for friendliness as of a desire for self-aggrandizement. And we are just aware of a sensitive tenderness towards others as we are aware of our hostilities towards others. And when this happens, he says, then we have no further need of being afraid of man, that man ceases to be this diabolic creature which he very often acts as, and he becomes something, a creature we can trust. Now this is a very interesting thing, because this goes back to the whole conception of Taoism, the intrinsic goodness of human nature, provided that we let it express itself in its totality without canalizing it and conditioning it by all kinds of nonsense, which we have always done. And it seems to me of the greatest interest that this immemorial wisdom of the mystics is coming back anyhow in one section at least of the modern psychological theory and practice. And it's a very encouraging fact, I find. And this, as I say, is certainly one of the products of total awareness, this awareness of our good sides as well as our evil sides, this awareness of the tenderness towards other people. And even more extraordinary than this, I think, is an awareness not only of the tenderness in ourselves, but of what may be called the tenderness in the universe. This strange fact that we become aware that the universe is in some way fundamentally all right, in spite of everything, in spite of death, in spite of suffering, that this is all right. We become aware as a result of this process of making ourselves totally aware, that even in the worst circumstances, this universe will not let us down completely. There's an extraordinary phrase, which you of course remember, even though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. This is the statement of somebody who's had total awareness and consequent understanding. And another similar statement, of course, is the infinitely hackneyed statement, God is love. Well, from the point of view of common sense, the first statement really seems the raving of a lunatic. Though he should slay me, yet will I trust in him. And the other statement, the statement that God is love, seems to fly in the face of all experience and to be obviously untrue. But of course, we must remember that common sense is not a product of total awareness. Common sense is a product of a very limited awareness. It's a product partly of self-interest, partly of the local traditions, partly of language, partly of passion, partly of prudence. And it is very, very far from being this attitude towards life produced by understanding, which in its turn is made possible by this total awareness. So that what a total awareness gives us then is, first of all, this knowledge of our impotence and our ignorance, with its corollary that we must, and certainly are, directed by something which is simultaneously immanent and transcendent, which keeps us going and prevents us going completely mad. And furthermore, another result of total awareness is the emptying of the memory, in the words of St. John of the Cross, with consequent ability to live here and now and to be aware of reality moment by moment as it arises. And finally, we become aware, first of all, that we are not as bad as we thought we were, and secondly, that the universe, in spite of everything, is all right, that there is this this goodness, this all rightness in the world. And in this state of understanding, these strange phrases used by the mystics take on meaning. Well, the logical positivists, of course, say that any metaphysical statement is meaningless, and of course, from the standpoint of common sense or of science, they are perfectly meaningless. But the moment there is understanding based upon total awareness, then these statements do have meaning. And such statements, for example, all in one and one in all, samsara and nirvana are the same, or multiplicity is unity, and unity is not so much one as not two. Then statements such as all things are void, and yet all things are the Dharma body of the Buddha, and so on. All these statements on the ordinary level of consciousness are without any meaning at all. But the moment there has been a preparation of total consciousness and an understanding of the nature of the world, then they take on, they are seen to be true, at least as true as verbal statements of ineffable experience can be. And the final result, I think, is, in Buddhist terminology, a fusion of the end with the means, the end being wisdom, prajna paramita, the realization of suchness, and the means being compassion, which is, or love, which is wisdom in action. This, I think, is the final result of understanding, and to my mind, the ultimate goal and final end of human life. And of course, this word love is perhaps the most worn and smudged and dog's-eared word in the whole of our vocabulary. It's worse even than that. It's been, thanks to it having been bawled from millions of pulpits and hundreds of millions of loudspeakers, it has a really dreadful quality now. It seems to be a kind of insult to good taste and decent feeling, almost a kind of obscenity which one hardly dares to pronounce. And yet, after all, this has to be pronounced, because finally, what is there? Well, the last word is love. This is the final statement, and is the final result of understanding. And with this last word, I'd better make this my own last word, bring this to a close. Let us pray that we may understand reality both in its height and its breadth, in its intensity and in its fullness. Let us pray that we may understand it not only in peace but in action, not only as the supreme wisdom but as universal love.